All right, so now in talking about habitats, we also have to talk about biodiversity, which is one of the very, very important things with maintaining and managing certain habitats. So, when we talk about biodiversity, what we're talking about is all of the different living organisms that are in one environment or in one area. This is going to include plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, all of that stuff is included in biodiversity. And it's not only the different types of organisms, but within that species, it's also the diversity of their genetics. So if we have like a whole group of elk, for just an example, and they are all very, very closely related to each other, we would say that they do not have a lot of diversity. This can be really, really bad when we're talking about wildlife diseases, natural disasters, invasive species. This has actually happened in Africa with cheetahs. So they went through something called a bottleneck, and we'll talk about that later in the notes, where the number of cheetahs went down to a very, very little amount. And then they rebounded. So they started breeding with each other again. But because they all came from a handful, they were all really, really inbred. And now there is actually a feline virus that all of these cheetahs are really, really susceptible to because of their lack of diversity in their genetics. So the health of the ecosystem is really, really dependent on biodiversity as well. We're also seeing this in the Midwest and in Wisconsin with the emerald ash borer. So, a lot of our woods are really, really ash heavy, and there's not a lot of biodiversity in those different tree species. So, now what is actually happening is our ecosystem is not becoming healthy, or it's not very healthy because that emerald ash borer is attacking all of our ash trees, and it's leaving huge swaths of just dead forest that you guys can see in Random Lake. When we have a lack of biodiversity, we say that our ecosystem becomes very, very fragile and not very resilient. So, resilience is going to be the ability of that habitat to recover from anything that happens to it. So, think about now what has happened with Hurricane Ian in Florida. A lot of these ecosystems have been wiped out, flattened by the floodwaters and the winds. But if there's high biodiversity in that area, that ecosystem is going to be able to bounce back really, really, really quickly and provide ecosystem services. So, those ecosystem services can be things like the list I have down below. So, reducing flooding, and droughts, and providing food, enabling soil formation, nutrient cycling. So, another example of some of those ecosystem services is all of the farm fields that we have around us in Random, where, especially like on the school grounds, all that area used to be low-lying swamp before they, kind of built everything up. So now what actually happens is when it rains a lot or snows a lot, and we get all that melt off and all of that good stuff, we get a lot of flooding in areas like that. Area 144 constantly floods whenever we get a lot of rain. If that area was not farm field and it was diverse swampland, we wouldn't have flooding like that because those different soils and all of those diverse vegetations can actually absorb more water. So it makes the ecosystem less fragile. So this leads us into talking about and discussing succession. So when an ecosystem is disturbed, gradually over many, many years, it rebounds. And that is called succession. And this is a natural process. It happens and it is really, really healthy. So down below here, if we have, for example, a fire go through an area, oops, back, go back. Ah. Little plants will grow in first, And then shrubs and scrub brush will grow in, and then we get a young forest, a mature forest, and then a climax forest. That climax community is different for every ecosystem. So, what that means is around here by us, a climax community might be oak trees and different things like that. Whereas in the Southwest, a climax community might be saguaro cactuses. In North Dakota, a climax community might be diverse grassland. So that is going to be different for each ecosystem. So when we're talking about this as well, we also have succession and we also have disturbances. So disturbances are natural functions when it is disturbed by an outside force. So it could be human caused or it could be something like a tornado or a fire. Succession is really, really different than human disturbance. So succession is slow. It enable populations to move in gradually. Disturbances kind of reverse succession. And this is when people will go through an area and will bulldoze something and make it go to an earlier stage of succession or even a completely different ecosystem based on what we want as humans, which is not always going to be the best. Um, a lot of this can cause habitat destruction because we're not allowing normal succession to actually happen. So, when we have disturbances, when they are natural, this is a really, really good way to kind of reset a habitat. So, for an example, aspen trees, and this primarily kind of happens out west, rely on disturbances because they are very shade intolerant. So they cannot grow when other trees are shading them over. And fire will go through an area, clear everything, allow those seeds to actually regenerate and make an aspen forest. About 20, 30 years later, a fire will go through, allow those seeds to regenerate, make another aspen forest, and so on and so on. Something else we're going to talk about in our later forest fire unit is jack pine trees specifically need fire in order to spread their seeds. So it's kind of a cool adaptation that jack pine trees have specifically. When we have human disturbances, they differ from natural disturbances because of the length of their impact. So if we have like a forest fire or tornado, it's like a rapid temporary change. When we have a human disturbance, such as like pollution, introduction of an invasive, destroying habitat with a road, that is going to be a long, steady change that is going to keep happening over and over and over again and not on like a 20 or 30-year cycle. And that it does not allow a habitat to rebound. Okay, it just doesn't allow it. So disturbance is part of natural cycles, but humans constantly disturbing doesn't allow that habitat to rebound, and it does not create a very resilient habitat. So resilience is the ability of a habitat to return to its previous state, and if we as humans keep impacting habitats over and over, it makes them less and less resilient. Um, when we lose biodiversity, habitats are less resilient. That's just how it is. And it's one of the most direct indicators of whether habitat is being negatively or positively infected by disturbance is the level of biodiversity. So move myself right here. So greater habitat disturbance typically means greater biodiversity as well. So just to recap what you talked about before with habitat fragmentation, one of these different kinds of disturbances is habitat fragmentation. And you learned in our previous unit that breaking up these habitats can really decrease the biodiversity of those different areas. So we'll just skip over that because you guys already talked about all of this habitat fragmentation. So in our next little lecture, we'll talk about ways that we can actually measure biodiversity.